Good morning, everyone, and welcome. This is FPRI's panel discussion on the elections in Zimbabwe and what they portend for the future of that country and the Southern Africa region. Joining me this morning will be Professor Paul Nantulya from the National Defense University, the Africa Center there. For those of you who are aware of what was scheduled for our program, Professor Ibbo Mandaza of the SAPES Trust in Zimbabwe had an emergency and will unable to join us this morning. But I can assure you that Professor Nantulya is quite capable of picking up the slack on that. As many of you know, these events are free to you, but not free to us. And so we encourage those of you who are not members of FPRI to consider joining and to support us as much as you can. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and about midway through the event, we will start taking up the questions from the audience. If you put them in the chat box, we might miss them. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Paul Nantulya. You've seen his bio, so there's no need to go into that, but I'd like to have him introduce himself and this morning's topic.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ray. It's a pleasure to be back on the FPRI. It's one of being on FPRI panels in the morning is one of my favorite things to do. So I was really looking forward to this particular meeting. I think I'll start out by just reminding colleagues and the audience about Zimbabwe's recent elections. So Zimbabwe had presidential and parliamentary elections on the 23rd and the 24th of August. Those elections repeated a trend that we have seen in Zimbabwe over the past 2 decades, going back to the era of the late Robert Mugabe. There was well-documented massive, widespread fraud in these polls, violence that was perpetrated in various voting districts and constituencies by the security forces and a shadowy paramilitary group known as FAS, which appears to have links with the Zimbabwe intelligence. And again, this was very well documented by not just by civil society organizations and local election observers, but also by SADC, the Southern African Development Community Election Observer Mission itself. And it issued a very damning report about those polls. And it was clear and explicit in that report that Zimbabwe failed to uphold not just its own constitutional requirements, but also failed to uphold well-established SADC norms and standards for elections, good governance, and democracy. But the SADC report also dovetailed with, it agreed, its findings also agree with the reports that were issued by the Commonwealth observers and by other observers, and also by findings of the African Union itself. So these elections, by any standards, even by Zimbabwe's own standards and by African standards, failed to pass the test. There was all kinds of malpractices, stuffed ballots, ballots arriving as many as 12 or even 15 hours late in many constituencies. And this was a problem across the board in constituencies where the ZANU-PF party is not dominant. Harare as well. There were so many problems in voting districts in Harare, these are opposition strongholds. So that trend was repeated across the country. Um, Again, the usual problems of lack of judicial independence. This is a has been a long-running problem in Zimbabwe. The judiciary is not independent, um, and there was hardly any meaningful third-party neutral observation going on, largely because the Zimbabwe government refused to accredit a number of external observers. So that's just the larger strategic setting of the situation that Zimbabwe finds itself. There's been a series of failed regional diplomatic efforts to try and bring about some kind of solution to this problem because it's a crisis of legitimacy. But these efforts that have been undertaken by SADC itself, by the SADC Organ for Politics, Defense and Security that is currently chaired by Zambia, and also by the SADC, the larger SADC summit that is chaired by Angola, have not yielded much. So Zimbabwe continues in this crisis that it faces with no end in sight. So that is the pessimistic context that I wanted to start this discussion on. Um, and it is tragic. It's tragic because Zimbabwe was one of Africa's most successful countries once upon a time. So it's really tragic. And the victims in all this are ordinary Zimbabweans. Over 2 million Zimbabweans are currently living in South Africa out of a population of 15 million in Zimbabwe. So that's quite a large chunk. And a significant part of it comes from the professional class, the lawyers, the medical workers, the teachers, the professors. I mean, it's Zimbabwe's professional class has been essentially degraded over the years because of this political crisis the country finds itself in.
Thank you. And I look back on looking at the election last August. I look back on my own experiences in Zimbabwe as ambassador there from 2009 to 2012, and my study of the country's history and your points about this continues a trend. I would go so far as to say it actually continues a trend that started in 1980 when the ZANU-PF under Mugabe came into Harare after the Lancaster House agreement, and immediately began to establish itself as literally the ruling party, right under the eyes of the U.S., the U.K., and the international community. And my own assessment of that is because at the time we were somewhat tied up with the competition with the Soviet Union in the Cold War, and Mugabe was not considered a Soviet client, whereas his political opponent Joshua Nkomo was supported by the Russians. We overlooked the fact that a lot of what we saw in this most recent election also took place, in fact, in some ways even worse, in the 1980 elections and in most of the elections since, where the ZANU-PF used intimidation and violence in those areas where it didn't have political supremacy to ensure its hold on power. One of the things that I won't say depresses me, but that's marked that's slightly different maybe in this election and the previous election, different from others, is that there were divisions within ZANU-PF that didn't quite rise to the surface. The younger people in ZANU-PF trying to get their share of the power from the older liberation generation, and my own knowledge of these people is that really wouldn't change that much the overall political calculus. They simply want their turn at the feeding trough. But the other thing that depressed me was the fact that while the opposition is dominant in the urban areas, and there's a lot of urbanization in Zimbabwe, the fact that the opposition has not ever really been able to coalesce as a single opposition to ZANU-PF simply adds to the effect of ZANU-PF actions. The opposition dilutes itself, and therefore it actually didn't take that much violence in this election cycle to tip the votes in favor of ZANU-PF. But so just, you sort of alluded to it, but I'd like to expand a little on what do you see happening in Zimbabwe over the next 5 years, or say between now and the next election? Because keeping in mind that uh, Emerson Mnangagwa, the current president, is not a youngster. I mean, he's in his late 70s or maybe even early 80s. I don't remember his age, but the military people and the intelligence people supporting him are also advanced in age. And how do you see the younger ZANU-PF people as they move up, when some of these people inevitably follow Mugabe off to the great beyond? And if the opposition continues to be divided as it is, what do you see happening in the next election?
Thank you. Look, the political horizon does not look good for Zimbabwe, and I'll tell you why. What has happened essentially since the coup that took place in 2017 is that the Zimbabwean state has become even more militarized than it was under Mugabe. You see, under Mugabe, there had been an effort to camouflage the military's role in politics. There was an effort to kind of give the military a professional face. It reflects civilian oversight, civilian authority, and to a very large extent, I mean, this was done very cleverly because international partners genuinely believed that the Zimbabwe Defense Force was one of the most professional outfits on the African continent. And it acquitted itself quite admirably. I worked in a previous life, I worked on peacekeeping issues in SADC, and I was a regular visitor to the Regional Peacekeeping Training Center, the RPTC in Harare, and I conducted quite a number of trainings there for these officers, and very impressive officer corps, very well spoken, highly educated. So I can understand. Those in the international community who still argue very strongly that the Zimbabwe military was essentially one of the best out there in Africa. I mean, in peacekeeping, its peacekeeping experience, and so on. If you look at its facilities, very well kept facilities, excellent academic or officer academic institutions, and so forth. But this was really a mirage, because while all this was taking place, there were other units of the Zimbabwe military that were being trained, that were outside that chain of command, that were outside, what I've been talking about. Units that were insulated from the extensive military professionalism programs that were run, for instance, by the British. The British military training teams that were at all levels of the professional military education system in Zimbabwe, right? But they were not allowed to interact with these units, like the unit that was trained by the North Koreans, which is implicated in these Matabeleland massacres. Very, very tragic, which up until now have not been properly discussed in the country. that was going on, right? So Zimbabwe really sits in this very hazy juncture where you have elements of the security services that seemed to be professional, but at the same time, rump sections of that military that were heavily politicized and actually even came from one particular ethnic group. So that has been the story of Zimbabwe, and I think what has happened over time is that the sort of deviant that section, of the military that was highly politicized and so on, that has now become the larger reality in which Zimbabwe's military has been sucked into. So going back to my point, the state is much more militarized. The party itself is much more militarized. Essentially, um, if one looks at what has been happening with ZANU over the past decade, there was a point at which it looked like ZANU was actually collapsing. It was imploding. And if it had not been for the military, which really is the backbone of ZANU PF, the party would have it was already disintegrated, right? And it is difficult to imagine a ZANU without support from the military. It's essentially a party army, and it is a party state. And this is what has happened in Zimbabwe. So yes, I agree with you. And the prognosis does not look good because while that militarization continues, you also have efforts by the party itself, or whatever is left of the party, um, to gain, which in fact it has. It has now crossed the threshold because there were by-elections just a few days ago, of which ZANU PF has now basically increased its parliamentary strength, and it has crossed now the two-thirds threshold that it needs to be able to introduce constitutional changes. And the talk in Zimbabwe now, and I was talking to some colleagues in Harare a few days ago in preparation for this meeting, that there's a suspicion that Mnangagwa, who's 81, is most certainly going to push for a third term. So in other words, Zimbabwe is now going to join a growing list of African parties that have overturned their constitutions and manipulated them in order to extend their stays in office. This is only going to make the situation worse. There have been more Zimbabweans that have fled the country after these elections. You always have these migrations of Zimbabweans after each election. The economic situation is not getting any better. Inflation is still a problem. Basic necessities are not available, and so the prognosis is not good. The lessons of history teach us that militaries are not meant to govern, um, and when a political system is built uh, to basically um, uh, uh, survive, to increase its longevity and its strength through military control, at some point there will be an implosion, and Zimbabwe appears to be traveling along that trajectory.
Good point. You talk about the fact that the ZANU-PF party was on the verge of imploding until the military stepped in and basically pulled the mask off and let the world see that they were actually the ones in charge. But I'd like to talk about, you mentioned something I think is very interesting, and that is there's actually two militaries in Zimbabwe. There's this politicized military that has been there forever, that's been sort of the enforcement arm, if you will, of the party leadership. But there are still, I would think, at least a few. They probably keep quiet just in order to survive. Military people, even in the officer corps, who would like to be a professional military but aren't allowed to. And so I guess my question there is, have they started to purge the military of these elements, or is there a possibility that the these two elements within the military itself could somehow contribute to this implosion of the Zimbabwean state?
No, that's an interesting point. I've read quite a number of interesting analyses out there by Zimbabweans about the Zimbabwean military, and the general analysis is basically what you've just pointed out, that in the Zimbabwe military there has always been a constituency um, that has seen itself as, espousing, professional standards of an apolitical military that is loyal to the constitution, that is well trained, that is well educated, and which respects its constitutional mandate. There's no question that there are elements within the Zimbabwe military that subscribe to these ideas. Unfortunately, that cadre within the Zimbabwean military and the larger security services as a whole has become more and more of an endangered species, if you will. There's less of it now than there was, say, a decade ago. And even in my own experience, I mean, in the many visits that I undertook to the RPTC in Harare, and discussions that senior people from the defense staff, and I remember that, and I remember that professionalism that you could actually see and experience. It's become less and less over the years, and so what you have now is, I think, what Mnangagwa in particular, one of the things that he has been able to achieve is to really uh, keep a hold on this, really resist. And very strong statements have been made, including the spokesperson of the government, Mr. Muchangwa, who has said that there's no such thing as professionalism, as in the professionalization of the Zimbabwe military. There had been hopes, which were largely misplaced, in my opinion, after the coup, that perhaps there was a course correction could actually ensue, given that Zimbabwe really badly needed to be integrated into the international community and really wanted to position itself in such a way that the sanctions can be removed. And obviously, this is one of the key requirements, is the professionalization of the military. But that was stalled. That was stalled. So basically, the Zimbabwe military is now basically in a time warp where very little can be done from within to bring about the kind of process that is really required, and which is also which Zimbabweans are demanding, which is an independent military that is not intervening in the political process. That has become much more difficult to achieve now. It may have been achieved a decade ago, or maybe 15 years ago, but at this stage, this is very, very difficult. Um, so that's where things are. That's where things are, and you're absolutely right. What you said at the beginning, that there was not a whole lot of international attention that was being given to this. To these early signs that were even evident, I would argue that were evident even during the liberation struggle. It was evident, right? These problems were evident, right? That at some point, there will be a move towards establishing some kind of de facto one-party state, and so on. And it came to pass. It came to pass. And unfortunately, at that point, um, a lot of these, countries, in particular countries like the UK, which had a lot of influence in different parts of the Zimbabwe government, were very, very reluctant to push Zimbabwe in this direction, in the direction of of building a more professional force, of ensuring that that you have a proper separation of powers and so on. I mean, very little was done to try and influence Zimbabwe in a more positive direction. So I think it was a tragedy. I think it was a lost opportunity, and this is the situation that we now have today. Um, so yeah.
That's very interesting, and I can't say I disagree with you about the missed opportunities. And you know, crying over spilt milk doesn't help, I suppose. But I have another question. You talked about the North Korean training of the 4th Battalion that was involved in the massacres in Matabeleland. But during my time there, from 2009 to 2012, the foreign country that seemed to have the most influence on the government writ large was China.
Mhm.
I mean, when the Chinese had a social reception, every senior member of the Zimbabwean military was present. What I have noticed, though, in the last, say, 3 to 5 years, is that the Russians seem to be asserting themselves, or maybe a better word is inserting themselves more into what's happening politically in Zimbabwe. I know just several months back, the Russians either sold or gave, I'm not sure which, the reports are conflicting, a number of helicopters to Zimbabwe, reportedly to be used for search and rescue and other efforts. What I see happening, and I don't know if many would agree with me, but I can see eventually a bit of a competition between China and Russia for who gets to call the shots in there. Mugabe, I know, didn't care much for the Russians. I'm not so sure about Mnangagwa, where his sympathies lie. How do you see this whole China-Russia influence on Zimbabwe playing out over the next few years?
Mm. The triangular relationship among ZANU-PF, China, and Russia is as old as ZANU, and it has always been a factor in Zimbabwean politics. Um, ZANU, almost from inception, was trained, mentored, and kitted out by the Chinese People's Liberation Army. All their historical commanders and fighters, Mnangagwa himself, received their foundational training in China, in Nanjing, to be specific. And so there's that very special relationship. And so there was a pipeline of fighters and commanders that were trained in various military schools, military and political schools in the People's Republic of China. And then you also had Chinese instructors on the African continent, mainly in Tanzania, but also other countries, which continued with that training on a more on a longer term basis. So in Tanzania, for instance, the ZANU had bases there, and in those bases, you had these Chinese instructors. I go into some of that in a study that I did for the U.S. Army War College. So it's a very tight relationship. Then ZANU's competitor, ZAPU, the Zimbabwe African People's Union, was supported by the Soviets, by the Soviet Union. So again, there was a pipeline, into the Soviet Union. Actually, a lot of them in Ukraine, in Soviet Ukraine, and so on. And then trained in Zambia, with by Soviet instructors. And these movements were antagonistic towards one another. There were so many cases of clashes, deadly clashes between these forces. Some of those took place in Tanzania, some took place in Zambia, and so on. And we saw this play out in the 1980 elections. We saw that violence play out in the 1980 elections, and it then culminated in this Matabeleland disaster. because ostensibly the ZANU state was now going against ZAPU fighters and was determined to destroy ZAPU. And ZAPU's base was Matabeleland. That was its base of support from the very beginning. So we've seen how that triangular relationship has affected the dynamic, because in private, Robert Mugabe was known to say very disparaging things about the Soviets, and stopping short of accusing the Soviets of being in cahoots with the Joshua Nkomo and those ZAPU forces, and providing them some of that equipment, these arms caches that were ostensibly uncovered ahead of the Matabeleland crisis. So there has been that competition between China and the Soviets and the Russians for influence to determine the political outcome, to determine political outcomes in Zimbabwe. Sometimes they've been very overt, but sometimes they've really been behind the scenes. But there's always been that tension in Zimbabwe, and I think that tension continues to play out today. With the kind of sanctions that Russia is facing after its invasion of Ukraine, African countries no longer have access to the credits that they had access to with various Russian defense firms. So many of them have been sanctioned. So what is happening is that China is slowly starting to fill that void by offering, these friendly terms and friendly pricing to various African countries, including Zimbabwe. So China effectively is a beneficiary of the sanctions that have been placed on the Russian Federation as a result of its activities in Ukraine. So one can say that at one level of analysis, there is a competitive relationship between Russia and China that continues in Zimbabwe, despite the fact that at a larger strategic level, the two countries have very friendly relations. But frankly speaking, when it comes to just the sheer resources, the money that China has at its disposal with its state-owned enterprises, its ability to provide loans and so on for all kinds of things, infrastructure, building the parliament, building the National Defense University in Harare, military housing and so on, and the roads and the bridges. China has a lot more economic clout than does Russia. That from the larger scheme of things, I think China has a lot more pull than Russia does. But nevertheless, Russia has a close relationship, a special relationship. These relationships become much more pronounced in situations where a country has effectively been frozen out of the international system. So Russia and China become an increasingly important prop for Zimbabwe, because Zimbabwe itself is also heavily sanctioned. And what Russia and China do is they provide opportunities for Zimbabwe to continue conducting, international transactions and continue accessing this equipment that it accesses, and also resources. I mean, Zimbabwe has some of the world's largest reserves of lithium, and it passed a law recently that it's no longer going to be importing raw lithium; it will be importing refined lithium, and so that is. These are different ways in which Zimbabwe has been able to leverage its resources to continue surviving internationally. But the reverse is also true, that Russia's ability to operate internationally and to engage in diplomatic work also depends on countries like Zimbabwe, right? Because Russia is also isolated. I mean, from from international commerce and international activity. So countries like Zimbabwe become very important, and I think we should we're going to continue to see a trend of the Kremlin improving and as much as possible, to the greatest extent possible, its relations with Zimbabwe. So that's just in a nutshell this very interesting triangular relationship, which I think is going to continue.
Interesting. You mentioned Zimbabwe's lithium deposits. I read somewhere that Zimbabwe is sitting on some of the world's largest rare earth metals deposits, and this issue of their decision not to export the raw ore, but to process it there. Of course, that requires building the infrastructure to do it, and I would assume that means Chinese projects to build the infrastructure, which further gives China a larger lock on rare earth materials. How do you see that as a factor in how the U.S. should view Zimbabwe in the coming decade or so?
Yes. No. Well, I think what are Zimbabwe's lifelines strategically? Uh, so South Africa is one. The ruling ANC. Zimbabwe needs that diplomatic support. It needs that diplomatic cover. So when we look at Zimbabwe's sources of survival, South Africa is one of them, the ANC in particular, from a diplomatic perspective. Then uh, Russia, China, North Korea, countries like Iran and so on, from a broader strategic frame, also become very key as far as the calculus of survival, the ZANU PF's calculus of survival is concerned. Then you have the natural resources, the rare earth minerals, the gold, the diamonds, right, that are in the ground. That Zimbabwe, which Zimbabwe is endowed with these minerals, become extremely important from a survival point of view. And we've seen that play out. So, for instance, because Zimbabwe has foreign exchange problems, right? Um, and we have seen the military being used to first of all guard these areas and then facilitate extraction with companies that have been formed by the Zimbabwe military, companies that then become subsidiaries of the foreign partners that are then called in uh, to extract these resources. We saw that in the Marange diamond mines, which have been very, very well documented. And what is interesting about these mining operations is that some of the proceeds from those mines were used to build Zimbabwe's defense university. This was a huge controversy some years back, and so those sorts of ties will continue simply because to be able to survive, to be able to perpetuate its hold on power, Zimbabwe is the incentive to use those resources and to work with countries um, with which ZANU has these historical ties becomes extremely strong. So I think we're going to see more of that. It's certainly playing out with lithium. It's playing out with platinum. Zimbabwe also sits on some significant reserves of platinum. Is going to continue. This is essentially um, a party state that is looking to survive, and so it's going to need diplomatic cover. It's going to need political support. It's going to need companies, from Russia, from China, that are able to come in to help it to exploit those resources. So that's essentially what we're looking at.
Hmm. You mentioned the support of South Africa, primarily the ANC, and of course, the ANC is facing its own challenges in the upcoming 2024 elections. What do you think would be the impact on Zimbabwe should the ANC lose power in South Africa?
That is a very interesting question. I wonder if there are people within ZANU-PF that are considering that scenario, because the ANC itself believes that it is, according to its own internal analysis, and it does this. The ANC is very good at this kind of thing. Its internal analysis is telling it that it is not going to get above 50% for the first time since 1994. So the likelihood of a coalition government is very high. And there's been a lot of speculation in terms of who is going to be the ANC's coalition partner at the national level, because the ANC is already in coalitions at the lower level, right? At the provincial level and in many municipalities around the country, the ANC is in a coalition. In some municipalities, the ANC is actually a minority party, a minority partner, right? So if that happens at the national level, I mean, it could create some significant tectonic shifts regionally, because the way the South African system is designed, without that dominance, especially in parliament, to do things like foreign policy, to do a lot of that work, you're going to require support from outside of the party. We've seen this play out in a number of scenarios already, right? So if one looks at the ANC position, the South African government's position on Israel, on the Israel-Gaza crisis, for instance, it required support from the EFF and other parties, right? This is something that the ANC could not achieve on its own, to achieve that commanding, overwhelming parliamentary vote, right, to downgrade relations with Israel. So we're seeing this, and we also saw it in the removal of President Zuma. It was EFF that brought that motion into parliament. So the ANC is already in that strange political environment, and if the elections, if South Africa's next elections go the way the ANC is expecting them to go, that is definitely going to have a geopolitical knock-on effect on Zimbabwe. And I wonder if the Zimbabwean stakeholders are thinking about that. But it's an interesting question.
Mm. Okay, thank you. We have a couple of questions, very interesting questions from the audience that I think we should take a look at. And although the first question has been partially answered, I think I will put forth the entire question, not just the unanswered part, and because there might be some new insights that you could add. Question is, the medium to long-term outlook is certainly poor, but could you comment on the fraudulent expulsion of CCC MPs and the attempted reciprocal counteraction against ZANU-PF, the resulting special election, and what ZANU-PF may wish to do regarding constitutional or legal changes should it obtain a supermajority?
Yes, I think ZANU-PF's history of conduct, its history of political conduct, tells us that it is going to most likely use its supermajority, because it has now gained over 2/3 as a result of these by-elections, to try and make constitutional and legal changes that will make it more comfortable politically going forward. Some have said, as I mentioned earlier, that might include changing the constitution to be able to allow President Mnangagwa to run for a third term. So I think that is something out there on the horizon that we should pay very close attention to. But on the flip side of that is the flip side of that is the opposition itself, because these by-elections came about not only due to ZANU-PF maneuvering, but also due to factions and within particularly the CCC. We've seen this before with the MDC, which also splintered into different factions, and which the ZANU-PF is able to manipulate and exploit to a very large extent. So I think the weaknesses of the opposition that we were discussing earlier have also contributed to this dynamic. But I'm always very careful when talking about opposition weaknesses, because I think we should always remember that Zimbabwe, the Zimbabwean party state, is operating in a very abnormal environment, okay, where the judiciary is not independent, okay, where violence is part of the political culture, is a critical element of the political culture of the ruling party. Intimidation, where there's partial application of the rule of law, okay, and where there's no redress. So this is an abnormal political environment. And that political environment suffocates opposition. To be in the opposition in Zimbabwe is one of the most dangerous things that a Zimbabwean citizen can do. Okay, because you can, well, first of all, it's physically dangerous. Okay. Secondly, it can affect one's livelihood. Okay, we have seen in these sorts of situations, you're going to get, you lose access to livelihoods and so on. So people like Nelson Chamisa and his colleagues, these are brave and courageous individuals. It is not easy in Zimbabwe to be a human rights activist, to be in civil society, to independently be able to be a private sector person, right? It's not a normal political environment. So I think it's important when we talk about opposition weaknesses, those weaknesses are also functional to that abnormality that I was talking about earlier. So I think we should be fair in that assessment. And Zimbabwe is not alone. I mean, we can say this about the state of the African opposition generally today. This is part of that that larger picture of the state of the African opposition today. It's endangered, and it is suffocated, and it is brutalized heavily. The costs of opposition are very, very tremendously high in many of these African countries. So I think we should always bear that in mind.
Right. Thank you. Another question. I wanted to understand your view on the position Zimbabwe finds itself in with international lenders like the Paris Club. What do you foresee as the future relationship between this government and its lenders moving forward, and how is this likely to play out?
I really don't see improvements. There might be cosmetic, improvements here and there. There may be some differences in language and delivery and so on the part of Zimbabwe and its international partners. But on the whole, I really don't see much. I don't see much. I think there had been some small windows of opening after 2017. Currently, there is a dialogue underway. There's a mechanism, right, between the IMF and Zimbabwe, and a number of benchmarks, and they meet regularly, to talk about different sectors. But I think beyond the humanitarian side, beyond services. I mean, essentially, resources that are extended to the non-governmental sector. I really do not see a pre 2000, because that's really when Zimbabwe started sliding to this situation that we're currently seeing now. Pre 2000, I don't see a pre 2000 Zimbabwe and a pre 2000 Zimbabwean engagement with international lenders. I don't see that. I don't see that coming anytime soon. There may be a few changes here and there, but on the whole, I don't see that coming, and I really don't see the sanctions going away either.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Would you care to comment on the legacy of the liberation struggle and ZANU-PF's propaganda and the impact it has had on the electorate?
The legacy, I think it's instrumentalized. I really wouldn't call it a legacy. It is instrumentalized. ZANU has an interest in instrumentalizing its role in the armed struggle. Which armed struggle, by the way, is in my opinion, is I mean, this the world accepted this as legitimate. Okay, Zimbabwe had a lot of support, from the Scandinavian countries, even in the United States, the United Kingdom, the ZANU itself. The whole idea of the independence was popular. But what has happened is that ZANU typically, which is typical of many other former liberation movements, is increasingly instrumentalizing its role and in instrumentalizing that. In fact, if one looks at the way that ZANU reacted to SADC when SADC released this report, it deployed this language and accused the Zambian president of using his role as the chairman of the SADC organ for politics, defense, and security in working in cahoots with imperial forces to try and effect regime change in Zimbabwe, to use SADC to effect regime change, right? So this is part of the ZANU language. It is part of the ZANU language. And I don't think it's going to change. I think we're going to see more of that. The idea that those who did not participate in the armed struggle really do not have legitimacy to govern or to be in politics. It's something. This is the everyday rhetoric of ZANU-PF. So I don't see that changing. I see it's going to continue. I don't really see it as a legacy. It's really an instrumentalization of that history and that process. Because if truth be told, it wasn't just ZANU. Ordinary Zimbabweans contributed to independence in that country. Ordinary Zimbabweans have contributed to Zimbabwe. And one good news story out of all of this is the resilience and the strength of Zimbabwean civil society. Extremely dynamic with all its problems, extremely determined, very patriotic, very inventive. I mean, if one looks at the process that Ibbo Mandaza and his colleagues, there was this, they put forward a very progressive agenda, pushing SADC and the African Union to appoint a special envoy to facilitate dialogue in Zimbabwe along very, very specific demands. This was done by Zimbabwean civil society organizations, which continue to be active and refuse to be silent. So I think that's the good news story, and I think this is also part of the story of Zimbabwe, and it is part of the legacy of Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe has a very dynamic and very active civil society, problems notwithstanding.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. How do you assess the effectiveness and outcomes of targeted travel and financial sanctions to date? And what, if any other effective policy options are there for the U.S. government to further counter undemocratic actions, state human rights abuses, and corruption in Zimbabwe?
Right. Well, the ZANU-PF elite have been sanctioned for over well over two decades now. Very few of them, if any, invest in the United States or in the West. Very few. Um, they will buy properties in South Africa, in North Africa, in Malaysia, in these eastern, these East Asian countries, and so on. So I think they've adjusted. They've adjusted to that. They've adjusted to that reality, and they have conducted themselves in a manner in which they can continue to um, take their money and park their money and secure properties outside of Zimbabwe unhindered. Okay, so if the questioner would like to know whether, for instance, the Zadira sanctions of the U.S. Congress are effective, I think they're being bypassed because very few of those assets are parked here in the United States. So I think that's the first element. So um, Congress, in other words, has very little leverage over what happens politically in Zimbabwe. And I think we've seen that since 2000. There has been no meaningful change in that direction. Zedera is very clear about the things that must change for those sanctions to be lifted. Um, it has really fallen on deaf ears in Harare. So I think that's one way of looking at it. In terms of the future, the kind of tools that, for instance, the United States might have, well, um, I don't really have a very clear answer to that, short of saying that there needs to be greater consistency when it comes to human rights, when it comes to democratization and things like constitutionalism. There's a need for consistency. I think uh, there's need for um, a policy that recognizes that support for democracy, for Democrats, for democratic movements, and so on, in Africa and perhaps even elsewhere, is not just something. Is not. This is not meant to be an afterthought. It should not be an afterthought. It really should be at the heart of engagement. Why do I say this? I say this because the Afrobarometer surveys continue to tell us that the vast majority of Africans, upwards of 70%, I think, according to the last survey round that came out last year, uh, demand for democratic system of government, oppose one-party states, oppose military rule, and believe that democracy is the most preferable form of government. Right? And when we consider the fact that this is the youngest continent on the planet with a median age of just 19, this is where that energy is coming from, right? This is where that demand is coming from. So, support for democracy is a strategic imperative. It is not just something that should be an inconvenience. So, I think there should be, um, greater a greater demonstration of consistency. Um, but that consistency should also bear in mind that these are tenets that Zimbabwe and other African countries have signed on to. You have the African Union architecture, the SADC architecture, right? African countries have clearly defined what democracy is and what democracy should look like. And I think that's where the conversation should begin. That ZANU PF is failing to live up to standards that SADC and the African Union themselves set, and Zimbabwe itself set. These are African standards. These are not Western. These are not Western standards or American standards. Because there's a language out there that democracy is a Western thing. and that it's an American thing or a European thing. No, it's an African. It's Africa. African governments have made it very clear that democracy is an African aspiration, and I think that's where the conversation should be.
Great. Well, thank you, and thanks to our audience for hanging in with us. This is a historical event, and that this is the first time that we managed to get to uh, all but one of the questions. Actually, we got one last. Thank you very much for the discussion. So, historically, we've never done this before. We got through all the audience questions this time. I want to thank you, Paul, for being with us and your most excellent presentation. Thanks to our audience for staying with us. And a reminder that in the chat, please fill out the survey. Tell us what you liked or didn't like about the presentation. Support us, please, so that we can bring more of these presentations to you. And the recording of this event will be on YouTube within a day or so. That those of you who would like can share it with your networks. And again, we hope to see you here at a future date. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.